For the next presentation, I invite Councillor Jenna Sudd, Councillor Eli Shelcheri, Councillor Teresa Kavanaugh, and Councillor Steve. There we go. There's some over here. Come on in here, come on, squeeze up a little more, guys. Well, it's my honor to welcome members of the 33rd Domestic Response Company to City Hall this morning. C'est un honneur de matin. I'd like to recognize Colonel Thomas Mackey, the commander of 33 Canadian Brigade Group, Lieutenant Colonel Gord Scarf, the commanding officer of the Cameron Highlanders, Honorary Colonel Dan Mackey, Cameron Highlanders of Ottawa, or Mackay, sorry, Duke of Edinburgh's own, Honorary Lieutenant Colonel Barbara Farber, Cameron Highlanders, Ottawa, Duke of Edinburgh's own, Major Jason Fox, second in command, 33 Domestic Response Company, and men and women of the Canadian Armed Forces that represent 33 Brigade. Today we are recognizing the 33 Domestic Response Company and these brave and dedicated individuals for their service to Canadians, and particularly the residents of Ottawa during the devastating flooding last spring. On Friday, April 26th, in response to my declaration of a state of emergency, 33 Canadian Brigade Group was requested to call up a domestic response company to aid with the relief efforts for the devastating floods that affected our region. 33 Canadian Brigade Group is a military formation comprised of 16 Army Reserve Force units from cities across the National Capital Region, but also as far south as Oshawa, north in Timmins, east in Cornwall, and west in Sault Ste. Marie. Within 48 hours of the official request for assistance, the Domestic Response Company was able to deploy close to 100 soldiers. Dès la demande d'assistance officielle envoyée, il n'a pas fallu 48 heures pour voir une centaine de soldats déployés. This number continued to grow, and at its peak, the Domestic Response Company had more than 160 soldiers assisting with the relief efforts. The majority of the soldiers are employed part-time with reserves and must balance careers, post-secondary institutions, families, and other commitments. Within the National Capital Region, the DRC provided exceptional assistance in a number of areas, including Cumberland, McLaren's Landing, on Lighthouse Lane, Constance Bay, and at the Lemieux Island Water Purification Plant. Today we recognize a cross-section of the dedicated soldiers from 33 Domestic Response Company. We asked the Armed Forces if they could provide suggestions of people who we should honor today, because we obviously couldn't have everyone here because it was in the hundreds. But I can tell you, in speaking with my colleagues who are up here with me, whose wards were most adversely affected, and Councillor Sudds, who's the chair of the Community and Protective Services Committee, there was this sense of great relief when the military arrived in communities like Fitzroy and Constance Bay and Cumberland, and protecting and securing the Britannia water filtration plant. For the first couple of days, as we all know, floods come slowly but surely, and they don't come all at once. And we thought we could handle it on our own with our great first responders, our firefighters, particularly the volunteers in rural Ottawa, our wonderful public works staff, police, paramedics, the hydro folks. But as the flooding continued and the ice continued to melt and the snowpack up north, it was clear we needed extra help to support our brave men and women of the Ottawa Public Service. You could see literally the relief in people's faces as the soldiers were coming in with the equipment that we didn't have, with the lab vehicles that could go into very flooded areas and rescue senior citizens who were trapped in McLaren's Landing or Constance Bay or on the shoreline in Cumberland Village. So the entire company, as we all saw, did outstanding work, putting their lives on hold to respond to the immediate emergency within the City of Ottawa and surrounding communities. Thank you for your dedication and your leadership. Your exceptional contributions made a very real difference in our ability to get through a devastating natural disaster. And as you know, as a result of climate change and the weather activities, we saw flooding in 2017, a tornado in 2018, and flooding again in 2019. So on behalf of all residents of the affected areas, and for that matter, the entire city, I want to thank all of you for your service. Au nom de tous les résidents touchés par les inondations.
On behalf of residents in the flooded areas and all the people of Ottawa, I want to thank you for your service.
Ask the Colonel to say a few words on behalf of the group. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you very much. Your Worship, the Mayor, members of City Council, merci de nous accueillir.
Thank you for welcoming us here to the City Hall in this beautiful city of Ottawa. It's a great pleasure for us to be here with you today. We're proud members of the Canadian Forces. We're proud members of the Reserve Forces as well. We're proud members of our own communities too. We're reservists. We have jobs, we have lives in civilian life. As the Mayor has already mentioned, we have students, we have professionals, and they are there. They're there among you in their civilian clothes, and perhaps you're not aware that they're part of the Canadian Armed Forces, but at night, over the weekends, and during crises and natural disasters, for example, they're there for you. They're there to serve their communities. And I have to tell you, really, that
happier than when they are serving directly for their citizens, protecting Canadians. And it is with tremendous pride that we're here today representing all of those that served during the flooding of 2019. And we are truly representative because there were many more soldiers from across Ontario, both regular Army soldiers and reserve soldiers, who were happy and proud to serve our fellow Canadians. So thank you very much for welcoming us here. It is a tremendous honor, and while I hope that we never have to do that again, we stand ready to serve again if required. Thank you very much.
Let's get a group picture. So come on up, everyone. Come on in. We're gonna... Now, I made a big faux pas. I didn't thank the Piper. Thank you, Piper. Very, very well done. So come on and squeeze in, everyone. We'll get a group shot around the podium. Teresa, tall people in the back. We're going to get...
Height and rank, man.
Very good answer.
Where's Barb?
Barb, right here. All right. I don't want to cut anyone off there. There we go. He doesn't want to smile.
A little bit further. Yeah. And you serve back.
Dan,
come on now.
Don't be shy.
You way in the back. This way. A little bit more. Good. Just give your, yeah, good. Just like that.
Don't move. Don't breathe.
Come on, Henry, smile.
One more. It's always one more, and it's never one more.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
One more.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Are we being piped down?
All right.
Okay, okay.
I don't think you want to stay for that. I think as Canadians, we feel very proud when we see the great work of our women and men in uniform. And thank you to our guests and our veterans who have joined us as well. Merci. The City Builder Award is presented today to Kim Steele in recognition of her many contributions in our community. Le prix de bâtisseur de la ville est décerné aujourd'hui à Kim Steele afin de souligner son apport considérable à notre communauté. I'd ask Kim to come forward, as well as her city councillor, West Carleton March's Eli El-Shantiri, to join us for the presentation. And Kim has brought a number of friends and family members, and welcome. Nice to have you here. And Kim said this is her very first time at City Hall, so good to have you here. There's Eli. The Mayor's City Builder Award recognizes people who have demonstrated an extraordinary commitment to making our city a better place through volunteerism and community activism. Kim Steele certainly meets these criteria. Today, we're recognizing you, Kim, for your outstanding volunteerism and service to your community in the West End. Kim has been offering free fitness classes at the Corkery Community Centre since 2006. Depuis 2006, Kim donne gratuitement des cours de conditionnement physique au Centre communautaire de Corkery. Her 3 90-minute classes each week have expanded access to fitness programming in rural Ottawa. Kim's classes are inclusive, enthusiastic, and fun, and have attracted many participants: women, men, entire families, teenagers, seniors, and people of all fitness levels. In addition to helping promote health and fitness in her community, Kim is also dedicated to helping others who need assistance. En plus de contribuer à promouvoir la santé et l'activité physique dans sa communauté, Kim se dévoue à aider ceux qui en ont le plus besoin. Kim's classes have become an avenue for collecting food for new mothers and cards for those who are ill or in need. And I'd like to take this opportunity, Kim, to thank you for your many contributions and for your strong commitment to health and fitness promotion. Je tiens à remercier Kim de son apport considérable à notre communauté. And on behalf of your City Councillor, Eli El-Shantiri, it's my pleasure to present you with the Mayor's City Builder Award. Thank you for all the good work you have done and will continue to do in the community. Congratulations. Come on out here, Kim, we'll take a picture. Right here.
I just want to take a moment to thank the ladies that are part of this group. Who knew from 2006, when we had 13, a cap of 13 for our class, that we'd grow to the size that we are now, and that it would be enduring, that we still have the class today. So I want to thank you for nominating me and doing all the work to put this together. And I'm so appreciative that you're able to show up on this day, a work day, to celebrate this with me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kim. Madam Deputy Clerk, roll call, please.
Councillor Luloff, Councillor Dudas. Here. Councillor Harder. Councillor Suds. Here. Councillor El-Shantiri.
Present.
Councillor Gower.
Here.
Councillor Kavanagh. Here. Councillor Shirelli. Councillor Egli.
Here.
Councillor Deans. Councillor Tierney.
Présent.
Conseil Fleury.
Ici.
Councillor King.
Here.
Councillor McKenney.
Present.
Councillor Leeper.
Présent.
Councillor Brockington.
Here.
Councillor Menard.
Here.
Conseil Cloutier.
Présent.
Councillor Blais.
Présent.
Councillor Deruze.
Here.
Councillor Moffat.
Here.
Councillor Meehan.
Here.
Councillor Hubley.
Here.
Mayor Watson.
EC.
You have a quorum, Mr. Mayor.
Confirmation of minutes for the regular council meeting on November 6, 2019. Carried. Declaration of interest, including those originally arising from prior meetings. Déclaration de conflit d'intérêt. Councillor El Shantiri, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I, Councillor Eli Al-Shantiri, declare potential direct procurement interest on Item 5, Ottawa City Council Agenda 24, Zoning Bylaw Amendment 2019, Flood Relief Provision, as I own a property in the area affected by the 2017 and 2019 flooding event.
Thank you. Any other conflicts? Communications as presented. Regrets, Councillor Deans and Councillor Luloff advised they would be absent from the council meeting of the 27th of November 2019. Motion to introduce reports. Motion portant présentation de rapport. Councillor Gower, please, seconded by Councillor Moffat.
That the deferred report from Community and Protective Services Committee entitled Motion Rat Complaints Inquiry, the report from the Integrity Commissioner entitled Integrity Commissioner 2019 Annual Report, Agricultural and Rural Affairs Committee Report 8, Built Heritage Subcommittee Report 7, Community and Protective Services Committee Reports 8 and 9, Standing Committee on Environmental Protection, Water and Waste Management Report 7, Finance and Economic Development Committee Report 9, Planning Committee Report 16, Transit Commission Report 3, Transportation Committee Report 6, and the reports from the City Clerk entitled Status Update, Council Inquiries and Motions for the period ending November 22nd, 2019, and summary of oral and written public submissions for items subject to the Planning Act explanation requirements at the City Council meeting of November 6, 2019, be received and considered.
On the motion, carried. Merci. Postponements and deferrals. CPS Committee Report number 7 deferred from the Council meeting of November 6. Rapport numéro 7 du Comité des services communautaires et de protection. Item 1, Councillor Fleury and King have a replacement motion on the rat complaint inquiry. Councillor Fleury.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, that Council approve the following revised recommendation, replacing those set out in the report for the Community and Protective Services Committee. That Council approve 1, that staff be directed to implement rat control methods, including specific rat prevention practices in regular parks maintenance and specific rat prevention practices such as pre-baiting in new infrastructure projects. And 2, that staff be directed to incorporate inspections for rats into the twice annual inspection of abandoned buildings and issue orders to the owners to remedy and at a neutral cost any infestation if evidence is found. 3, that staff in planning, infrastructure, and economic development be directed to assess the options, including legal services, under their mandate to implement a program for proactive rat baiting prior to the construction and issuing demolition permits and development application, and if such program is possible, report back to the appropriate committee with recommendations including how such a program could be administered, detail any financial impact, and what monitoring could be put in place to assess its effectiveness. And 4, that the Mayor, on behalf of Council, write to the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing, requesting that the province expand the definition of applicable law under the Building Code to include bylaws made by the municipality for proactive rat baiting in relations to the demolition requiring a permit under the Building Code Act 1992.
So if there's a lot of debate on this, we'll come back to it. I would prefer, this thing has been before us so many times. It's a long issue, Councillor Brockington, and the monitor is not working on my desk, please. Do you have a lot to talk about on rats? Okay, we'll hold that. Yep. All right.
Hold the rats, hold the rats.
Next is the Integrity Commissioner's report. We'll come back to that. Item 3, City Clerk status update on inquiries received.
Received.
Committee reports, Agriculture and Rural Affairs Committee report number 8, rapport numéro 8 de règlement zonage, 5651 First Line Road. Carried. Zoning bylaw amendment, flood relief provisions. Councillor El Shantiri is stepping away from the table. 2019 flood relief provision, modification de règlement de zonage, disposition de 2019 en matière de secours en cas d'inondation. Carried. Item 6, Hobbs Municipal Drain Outlet Extension. Carried. Item 7, exemptions to permanent signs on private property bylaw in Ward 5. Carried. Build Heritage Subcommittee Report Number 6, rapport numéro 6 de sous-comité de patrimoine bâti. Item 8, additions to Heritage Registry citywide. Carried. Item 8, report on rental accommodation. We have a number of motions, so we'll come back to that. Item 10, Lansdowne Partnership. We have a number of motions. We'll come back to that. Item 11, expansion of Bayview Yards at 7 Bayview Road, Station Road, agrandissement des cours Bayview au 7 chemin Bayview Station. Carried. It's good to see them growing. Item 12, Spark Street Public Realm Plan. Carried. Item Planning Committee Report Number 16, rapport numéro 16 du Comité de l'Urbanisme. Item 13, Zoning Bylaw Amendment 1970 Maryville Road and 22 Slack Road. Carried. Item 14, Official Plan and Zoning Bylaw Amendments 89 Richmond Road, modification au plan officiel et au règlement de zonage 49 Chemin Richmond. 89, je m'excuse. Item 15, modification au règlement de zonage et plan de lotissement 21 Avenue Withrow. Carried. And dissents by Menard, McKenney. All right. Yeas and nays on this, on Withrow? Yes, if you're supporting the committee recommendation.
Councillor Leeper.
No.
Councillor Gower.
Yes.
Councillor Deans. Councillor Harder. Yes. Councillor Egla.
No.
Councillor Hubley.
Yes.
Councillor Suds.
Yes.
Councillor El Shantiri.
Yes.
Councillor Dudas.
Yes.
Councillor Menard.
No.
Councillor Shirelli. Conseil Cloutier.
Oui.
Councillor Tierney.
Yes.
Councillor Brockington.
Yes.
Councillor Meehan.
Yes.
Councillor DeRuse.
Yes.
Conseil Fleury.
No.
Councillor Blais.
Yes.
Councillor McKenney.
No.
Councillor King.
No.
Councillor Moffat.
Yes.
Councillor Kavanaugh.
Yes.
Councillor Luloff. Mayor Watson.
Yes.
Sorry.
15
That should have been
yeas.
no. Sorry.
With the concurrence of council? Okay.
Thank you. Sorry.
So 14 to 7.
Okay. Item 16, zoning bylaw 2159 Mer Bleue Road, modification au règlement de zonage 2159 chemin de la Mer Bleue. Carried. Item 17, housing mix in new residential communities, type d'habitation permis dans les nouvelles collectivités résidentielles. Carried. Dissent by Councillor Blais. Is it a quick item or do we come back to it, Councillor?
I'd just like to lift it and talk about it. Is that possible?
Sorry?
Could I talk about lift this?
Yeah,
and-
we'll come back to
Thank
it
you.
then. Item 18, City of Ottawa zoning bylaw 2008-250 omnibus amendments Q4 2019, règlement général de zonage 2008.250 modification d'ordre général. Carried. A lot of work on that, Councillor Harder and Tierney. Thank you. Item 19, motion, council resolution regarding Section 45 of the Planning Act in respect to 473 Albert Street. Résolution du Conseil concernant 473 Rue Albert. Carried. Item 20, Transit Commission Report Number 3, Delegation of Authority. Received. Transportation Committee Report Number 6, rapport numéro 6 du Comité des Transports Community Safety Zones Implementation Plan. Carried. Item 22, Service Delivery Review of Winter Operations. Received. Does anyone wish to remove anything from the bulk consent agenda? On the bulk consent agenda as presented? Carried. Okay, so we have the Integrity Commissioner's report. If we could ask Mr. Marlowe to... Oh, I'm sorry. Does anyone have any questions? I apologize. He doesn't have a presentation. Are there any questions to the Integrity Commissioner? No. Okay. Received? Received. Thank you, Mr. Marlowe. Merci, Mr. Marlowe. So back to the issue of rats. Councillor Brockington had the floor on that. Councillor Brockington.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just 2 comments. First of all, the Fleury King motion is very reactionary in nature, and I wanted to ask staff about the proactive element, in particular in problematic neighborhoods. Can staff list for us how they are being proactive in neighborhoods with chronic rat issues instead of waiting for members of the community to file reports with 311? This motion is very light on the city being more proactive. So I just wanted to get a sense in that regard.
Mayor, in terms of Public Works Environmental Services, we have basically 2 initiatives. One, we proactively bait in the sewers where CCTV cameras during our routine maintenance regime sees evidence. So that's one area. And then the second area, we have protocols in place for any evidence in parks where we see, generally around litter containers, we see evidence of rats, and we have measures in place to combat when we see rats in parks.
I know that Ottawa Public Health has developed a postcard-sized information bulletin. I think there's 5 points that homeowners can do or landlords can do to protect their properties, to make them less inviting for rats to set up shop there. But I would really like to see a much more proactive wave by the city in neighborhoods where we've had rat issues. And I don't think we're doing that. I think we have some resources available through Public Works or Ottawa Public Health when people call, but we need to be much more proactive to try and address this issue before neighborhoods become overrun with rats. So while I'm supportive of the motion before us, I don't think we're doing enough in that regard on being proactive. My other question, and I asked this of the General Manager of Public Works at committee a number of months ago, and I just want to get reassurance again today at council, is there are 2 sewer infrastructure jobs that are going to take place in my ward in 2020, one in Carlton Heights where we do have a rat issue and another in Carlington. And I would like confirmation from yourself that there will be proactive baiting in the vicinity of these jobs to ensure that, again, rat migration issues when we start to chew up and open up the sewer lines doesn't become a problem. Can I get that commitment?
Mr. Mayor, right now, we, in the Montreal Road project, for the first time, we've actually put proactive bat rating into the tender, and we're just receiving those tender results right now to understand what the cost implications are. But if that's council's will and direction, we can take that direction for those additional projects.
But what would that entail? I mean, I don't think this requires council's direction. I have 3 streets in 2 neighborhoods that are going to have their sewers replaced next year. In one of those neighborhoods, we have a rat issue. And the fear is that when we start opening up these lines in the street, we're going to see rats in part of this neighborhood that we don't see them now. Can we get some proactive baiting and educational flyers in these communities before that work gets done?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, we'll work with our colleagues in infrastructure services to get a plan together to proactively bait those sewers that are adjacent to the work that's being done to make sure that's captured. And I'll work with our health and bylaw colleagues as well to make sure that we get some education out in the neighborhood.
All right, thank you very much, and I will reach out to you as well. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Councillor Hubley, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd like to follow up on this too. We had an earlier inquiry on this, and there was, some reporting done of it over the summer. And if I recall correctly, the majority of where the complaints are coming from are Ottawa housing areas. So I'm wondering, does this new bylaw apply to Ottawa housing? Are we looking at using this to pressure Ottawa housing to deal with the rat issue? Why can't we just do that as a direction to them to step up rat baiting on their properties?
Mr. Mayor, I think that's a property standards issue, and I'll let Mr. DeMonte address it.
Mayor, for all property standards issue, we respond to those calls if there's in 311, and if we have any evidence, we'll take the appropriate measure.
Has advised that secondary dwelling units and coach houses as defined in the zoning bylaw are not commonplace in a rural area of the city, with the proximity 132 secondary dwelling unit and 7 coach houses have been established in the rural area since 2001. And whereas as a result and describable to consider whether greater flexibility should be allowed for short-term rental uses of secondary dwelling units and coach houses in the rural areas of the city, while excluding such in the urban and suburban area. Therefore, be it resolved that Council approve the following amendment to recommendation 3B of the report in order to address secondary dwelling unit and coach houses in the rural area of the city. Being the rural area as shown on Schedule A of the official plan, direct the General Manager of Planning, Infrastructure, and Economic Development to develop a temporary use bylaw for short-term rental use in residential area for approval by Planning Committee and Council as described in this report, and include as a part of the work consideration for allowing secondary dwelling unit and coach houses in the rural area as shown on Schedule A of the official plan to be used for short-term rental regardless of the occupancy. Can we talk about this now, Mr. Mayor, or do you want to just introduce the motion? We can speak about it.
No, we'll just introduce now to get them all on the floor. Thank you, Councillor El-Shantiri. Our next motion on this item is by Councillor Menard, seconded by Councillor King. Councillor Menard, if you'd like to introduce it, please.
Thanks very much, Mr. Mayor. Whereas the report dated September 23rd, 2019, entitled Regulation of Long-Term Rental Accommodations by McLaren Municipal Consulting recommends that the city initiate a 2-year pilot landlord registration system, and whereas a landlord registration system would allow for a more proactive approach to enforcement of city bylaws, and whereas many tenants are unaware of their rights and responsibilities as tenants under the provision of Ottawa's bylaws, and whereas various forms of landlord registration already exists in multiple municipalities across Ontario, including Toronto. Be it resolved that Council direct the General Manager of Emergency and Protective Services to review and report back to the Community and Protective Services Committee in Q3 2020 on the feasibility of a 2-year pilot landlord registration system, including how the preferred option would be implemented, expected impediments to implementation of the preferred option, the expected costs of implementing the preferred option to the city, landlords, and tenants, including the expected costs of the preferred option if it were executed under a revenue-neutral model.
Okay, and then a direction to staff, Councillor Meehan.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My direction is, as Ottawa begins to implement the new regulatory regime as outlined in the report on rental accommodation study, that staff be directed to continue to examine, as part of the project, the impact on the community of large groups, short and long-term rentals. In addition, that staff look at other municipalities, such as Toronto, who have or are implementing regulations on both short and long-term rentals with respect to large group rental accommodations, and to report back to Committee and Council with their observations and any proposed solutions that would address large group short-term and long-term rental accommodations in residential areas. And I should say this direction comes from Councillor Dean's office.
Okay, so we'll come back to that. Okay, so we have 2 motions and 1 direction. Any other motions? Okay, so on the report, questions, comments, who would like to begin? Councillor Suggs, whose committee dealt with this. It was a long day, so thank you for your...
So on the report itself, I really just wanted to, first of all, extend my thanks to staff who I know have dedicated a lot of energy over the last number of months on this. You know, going through this process, I think we've all learned a lot. We have over 6,000 properties listed on short-term rental platforms in Ottawa. We have about 1,300 of those which appear to be commercial or investment properties. I think as we've gone through this and the many discussions that have been had over the last number of weeks, the commercial activities in residential zones, we need to recognize is illegal currently in residential neighborhoods. And these proposed properties under the new policy would also be prohibited. The policy recommendations that have been put forward on short-term rentals limit short-term rentals to primary residences only. This is supported by a low-cost permit requirement and regulations that I think are adequate for our hosts, our property managers, and our platforms, and it makes good public policy. I think with the objectives of ensuring the fabric of our neighborhoods are upheld, while also looking at our housing stock for long-term rentals and ensuring that that does not further become deteriorate or become compromised, that we have good policy directions in front of us. This is proposed as a 3-year trial period. And this does give us the opportunity to come back and reassess in 3 years how it's working for us. It's also consistent with provincial housing policy and local planning principles that have been identified from other jurisdictions. So again, I thank staff. I ask my colleagues to support the report. I know we have motions to deal with as well, but on the report itself, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Suggs. Councillor Fleury on the report and motions.
Merci, Monsieur le Maire.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. A lot of information, a substantial report. In my 9 years around this table, I think this is the biggest report we've ever seen. I want to thank the team that worked on this analysis. It's an in-depth analysis that took into consideration all aspects. We recognize that we don't have all the tools. It's important to say it. We are still treated by the province like a municipality with some powers, but not all. So we carried a motion at the Community and Protection Services Committee, and I'd like us to have the same standards that we have for the short-term platforms. And I would like us to have more authorities for fines. I see many issues with that, and regarding the resolution period too. I mean, we do what we can with the powers that we have, but we have to keep going so that the people that are not complying get punitive action, because some landlords still do that. Some groups talk about the importance of having a good fine structures, but we have to target the issues, the problems first. It's very important.
Post the committee as it relates to the staff's legal analysis of what we believe to be our limitations under the Municipal Act for short-term rent contracts. And I want to ensure that I understand that, are we saying that we believe that a short-term environment is a contract? And if we believe it is a contract, do we believe that that is an interest in real estate? Because the entire legal argument is that we can't go there because there's an interest in real estate, yet we don't define what is that, other than I've seen a couple of components as it relates to the wording of contract. And I want to clarify, from our legal perspective, does that meet the limitations of interest in real estate?
Mr. Mayor, if I understand the question correctly, it's in terms of the limitations that have been identified with respect to a licensing regime in any matter that relates to the
short-term rentals in this context.
If I go back to the legal comments that have been provided in the past, the restriction is not solely with respect, it does not deal with short-term rentals. In respect of licensing, it is in respect of the limitations imposed under the regulations under the Municipal Act that relate to essentially the business of real estate generally, and that includes rental, advertising, promotion, any of those kinds of things, and that's an existing restriction that the province has left in place in the regulations under the Municipal Act.
I'm not a lawyer, and I will trust you, but I'm confident that following the direction of committee that we are asking for the province to give us the authority around the business licensing, which would achieve what I'm looking for, which is a licensing environment for the platforms, that we're heading in the right direction. That said, I do believe, like, the argument of a short-term rental being a contract, in my mind, softens that up, because we have all sorts of contract that interact with real estate for which we license. And I could enumerate a few, but I'll spare you that. I will support the report. Again, in French, I said, I believe this is the most substantial, comprehensive report we've done. Everyone has a perspective, that from rooming house to rentals to short-term rentals. I really believe that we've used a strong fundamentals to bring the authority. I want to remind those, because we have canned emails that have come to our mailbox for short-term renters. I want to remind all of us that the majority of short-term renters who are on those platforms it's their main living area, so they would be compliant. So they would be able, under this proposal, to continue to operate. The small minority who continue to grow that are doing so commercially would no longer. So when you get an email saying that we're shutting all of it down, it is false. The majority who are using those platforms will continue to be able to do short-term rentals. As for the rental component, and I only have a few seconds left, we really need to pursue the province on the fine structure, on the authorities, on the response timelines. That's where the next battle needs to go.
Merci, Conseiller Fleury. Conseiller Leeper, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, Chair. May I just ask staff what interpretation they make of the proposed direction with respect to large group short-term rentals? Because I've got to be honest, I'm not entirely sure what that means.
Madam Deputy Mayor, from staff's perspective, that is something we will look at. So if we build our permit regime as is proposed in the report, we will look at occupancy standards, we will look at what is casually called party house provisions, and make sure that there are regulations and permit conditions to regulate those types of uses. So by large group, I assume that we mean up to the lawful occupancy limit, or crossing the line into beyond, so in excess of the occupancy limit. And that is something we will look at very carefully as part of our permit issuance conditions and as part of our regulations in our proposed short-term rental bylaw.
I'm sorry, I'm still not sure what we mean by large group short-term rentals.
The direction did not provide a definition, as you know. So what I am assuming is that we're looking at occupancy limits. So how many people can lawfully occupy that particular dwelling? So as you know, what we're proposing as part of our permit regime, we'll be coming back to you with that in a bylaw, is to uphold the current occupancy limits that are in the property standards bylaw now, which are based on a formula. We'll make that a permit requirement. We will also build in some checks and balances in the permit regime so that those things can be verified, that the consumer knows what the occupancy limits are.
Okay. That's great. Thank you for the further clarity. Thanks, Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Leeper. Councillor Kavanagh.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank staff for all the hard work they've put into all this study on accommodation review for rental accommodation, including short-term and long-term. In particular, the short-term, I believe that we've struck a balance in terms of owner-occupied short-term rental versus ghost hotels or non-occupant short-term rentals. And I think that's really important because there are people out there that are doing short-term rentals that are owner-occupied, and they're following the rules. They're keeping it safe and quiet. And that's really important that allowance is made. And that we keep out the ones where they're not supervised, and that's where the problems have been. And I truly appreciate all the work. In terms of the of long-term rentals and inspections, I will be supporting the motion put forward by Councillor Menard, pardon me, because I believe that we need to be more proactive measures on things like inspections so that people don't have to keep reporting. And we also need a mechanism to pay for bylaw officers because it's a stress on our system. Everything is about bylaw and sending bylaw officers to check on accommodations. So it concerns me that we're getting a couple more, but I'm not sure if that'll be able to keep up. We're already stressing out our bylaws, and I hope that we can be more proactive in terms of having places that people know when they walk in that are suitable. So I support this two-year pilot project on landlord registration. I have a question for Councillor Shantiri, regarding his motion. Who is it aimed at? Is this something specific in terms of the rural areas? Is this like hockey tournaments or something that specific for the request you're making?
Mayor? What we're trying to do, Councillor, here in the rural area, as you know, we have no hotel, no motel, no other place for accommodation. During the floods, and the tornado, we saw a great benefit of some of our residents taking other residents to keep their kids in the school, in the local church, and their local activities. So we saw a benefit from having that option available for them. I'm not sure if some of them went through the platform of Airbnb or other, but we know quite a bit of residents that were accommodated, especially in the tornadoes, with residents within the community. So I don't want to take that option away, so I'm hoping my colleague will support that on that base.
So they weren't doing it for charity, they were doing it to be paid?
Yeah, some of them.
Okay, interesting. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Brockington. Councillor Leeper, did you have your name on the list?
I was on and on.
Okay. Councillor Brockington, please.
Thank you, Your Worship. And I, too, would just want to thank staff for the amount of work that went into this study and report, echoing Councillor Fleury's earlier comments, the consultations, the white paper, the engagement from River Ward community residents and community associations. This is obviously a multi-ward issue, and I think it has progressed very well. So I will be supporting the main bits of this motion. Certainly the shared economy is forcing municipalities to look at its regulatory regime in a number of fronts. We certainly saw that when Uber arrived in 2014 and forced the city after a few years to look at the entire industry and come out with some very strong regulations. And this is no different. This is another piece of the shared economy that just basically run for a number of years without a lot of rules or regulation. And as I said at committee, this is the time where we have to address that. And sometimes it's some of the bad apples that require municipalities to step forward and create a regime, ground rules to be followed. This really is to help protect communities and even help protect people who are staying in these accommodations, these rental accommodations. Just a few questions, if I may, for staff. One is actually an email that members of council received today, and it's along the lines of owner-occupied duplexes or triplexes, and I'll just read directly from the email the question. It says, in its recommendations, staff has broadly went against the general public support in favor of allowing Airbnbs in secondary and attached units in owner-occupied properties, as illustrated in the McLaren report. Can staff just, again, touch upon why duplexes and other shared units were excluded?
Mr. Mayor, the policy thinking behind that is that lawful secondary dwelling units were created with the planning principle in mind that they provide available long-term housing stock for diverse segments of the population. And on that basis, the province has put in specific rules to create them. In terms of keeping in pace with those rules, we recommend that they not be available for short-term rental and that they continue to be protected for that type of housing.
So the staff argument for this particular dwelling type was to protect rental opportunities, long-term rental opportunities. Very good. Okay. The 28-day cap, can you just talk to me about the cap? Why 28 days? Many months are 31 days in length. Why not align with the maximum number of days in a particular month?
Mr. Mayor, when we come back with the short-term rental bylaw, we will have a fully developed definition of what is a short-term rental. The working definition now, and as a best practice in other jurisdictions, is along the lines of anything that is a month or over is something that can typically be looked at under the Residential Tenancies Act for residential tenancies. A month seems to be the logical dividing line between what is the difference between someone living there versus what is a transient or occasional use for the traveling public, for tourists, or for guests. And so 28 days being the shortest month of the year, so 28 days or over, is a logical logical line to look at residential tenancies. Less than 28 days brings us into the area of something that could be transient. And that dividing line has been used in many contexts.
I'm not going to arm wrestle with you today about the number of days. I think 31 is probably a bit cleaner, but we can get to that a bit later. Condo board declarations and the condos that take positions where they do not want to invite or welcome this type of accommodation. City staff is asking for a declaration. I've been asked whether or not a simple proof that a bylaw has been passed, is that good enough? Explain to me about sort of the additional requirements we're going to impose on condo boards.
Our thinking on that is that a declaration is more than just the simple bylaws of the board. So whether it's on the condo side, whether it's a declaration, and on the landlord side, whether it's a copy of a lease, for example, the policy thinking is that for those types of premises where their own governing rules prohibit short-term rentals, we want to respect that and not issue short-term rental permits in those circumstances. We will be coming back with a short-term rental bylaw where we look at the proof that you're inquiring about. So declarations, leases, and any other type of document that would serve the same purpose.
So if a declaration is silent on these types of rentals because it was created 40 years ago, for example, but they also had attached bylaws that are passed, other things that the board has done since then, is that good enough?
We'll be coming back with those rules. It's certainly something we'll be looking at.
Okay, very well, because that does exist. These issues are prevalent in older condo organizations. Just on the Menard motion, if staff could talk about, he's not asking us to implement something, he's asking for some research and work to be done and a report to come back through, I guess, the committee. Could staff just comment on what's being proposed?
Mayor, we've worked respectfully with the councillor in his office. At the onset, we feel, and that's why the recommendations in the report don't go in the direction that the councillor is proposing. When we analyzed what McLaren did in their consulting, over 88% of tenants in their survey said that landlords made repairs when they were requested. 9 out of 10 properties hadn't had a property standards request in our data for over the last decade. And we identified was a very small amount of, and I don't want to use a word delinquent, but a very small amount of property owners seem to create the vast majority of issues. And so we thought the approach, instead of taking a very strong regulatory enforcement approach, is we would have a focused approach to the areas where we thought there were challenges, and we're able to identify those rental properties. So the additional staff in here, we think it's a balanced approach of being able to correct those challenges in the community, at the same time not overwhelming. And when we start getting into the analysis and we looked at what other jurisdictions did, the report has 4 different types of scenarios about universal licensing and the inspection regime and what that would require, and it's significant resources that would require. So there would be a balance there that we'd have to find costs to offset that, and then that cost ultimately would be passed on to renters, and again we'd be increasing costs over all of the stock. So again, like this entire report, there's pros and cons to both sides. Our logic was that we would prefer to attempt this over the next 3 years, analyze what would be going on, and then come back and report if that's not effective. And I think the councillor's trying to get there, but there may be some challenges with regards to that, but we can talk to the motion more in detail when it comes forward. But broadly, that's our approach. The data didn't support a very strong regulatory regime at this point.
In speaking with your colleagues in other municipalities who have actually gone further in this regard, what's happening in those municipalities that's different than Ottawa? I would assume that we have very similar issues impacting our tenants, the same type of absentee landlords. I'm not speaking in general terms, but the same type of issues. So why would they have done something, and when we have the opportunity just to ask you for a report, why we wouldn't do that?
Mr. Mayor, my understanding of where forms of landlord regulation have existed in other municipalities, it's to address issues that are prevalent there.
Right.
So the Rent Safe TO program, for example, is a registration system that only addresses high-rises. It is funded in a very particular way, partly by the tax roll, for example, and it sets out an inspection regime over time. We don't have that same landscape here, and as Mr. DeMonte just said, we have a very small percentage of rental properties that are causing the biggest amount of problems. In other jurisdictions, we've seen landlord regulations developed around specific geographic areas, for example, around post-secondary institutions. Again, we don't have that type of landscape here. So those regimes are front-heavy in the sense of costs for inspections, and it is not something that we feel the data justifies here, because eventually it requires more resources and the cost could be passed on to the tenant. So it's not comparing apples to apples, for lack of a better way to say it. It's a different landscape.
Okay, I appreciate that comment. Thank you very much. Again, thank you for the effort that has gone into this. And my colleagues who spent 10.5 hours at committee last week going through this. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. We're dealing both with the motions and the main report. Councillor King, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. On short-term accommodation, I have to agree with many of my colleagues, residents, constituents who I've spoken to since I've taken office, and I fully agree that residents are completely fatigued with commercial operations in residential zones. And they're also concerned about the appropriateness of the shared economy, short-term rental accommodation platforms that have been put in place that create scarcity, more scarcity in our city in terms of rentals. And I know that within my own neighborhood, residents have been concerned about increasing criminal activity. A while back, we had a shooting in Overbrook that was in front of a short-term rental accommodation area, and decreasing property standards. So because of these factors and some of the consultation that I've had with community members, I will be in favor of the report. On long-term accommodation, I support and have seconded Councillor Menard's motion because I believe a feasibility review of a 2-year landlord registration pilot is warranted to determine the viability of a more proactive approach to enforce city bylaws concerning property standards. Too often I hear from residents in low-income housing that the biggest problem they experience, beside the cost of rent, is the state of disrepair in apartment buildings. The problems they experience include pest infestations, elevators not working for long periods of time, problems with proper heating, safety issues related to doors not locking properly, and the lack of basic repairs in apartments which tenants are entitled to but are not receiving. Additionally, the problems that many of these residents experience cannot easily be addressed through bylaw enforcement action because currently the property standard bylaw has more procedural steps and delays than most bylaws, in addition to previous notices of violation often being unenforceable. Such a situation has left many of our most vulnerable residents even more vulnerable. Consequently, low-income tenants have come to me and have asked us to implement a landlord licensing program to make landlords more accountable for their actions. They want property owners to be given a list of minimum property standards that they would be required to meet, in addition to mechanisms to ensure property standards are met and maintained. And they want consequential financial penalties for property owners that are non-compliant. With some of the changes proposed to long-term accommodation in the city, we will see some enhancements to property reinspection for landlords, but tenants are asking for further action. At a bare minimum, they want a registration program with detailed information about properties, along with outstanding work order and violation data. Such a system would at least ensure property reporting and movement towards a more advanced system that will actually hold landlords accountable for their actions. That's why I was happy to, and I'm happy to second Councillor Menard's motion. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Dudas, please.
I had a question specific to the rule motion. I just wanted, and I will be supporting it because I think it's important that we show the differences of our community and that there's a different kind of need in those particular areas. But I did want to understand, I know the province was quite clear through LPAT in respect to Toronto's bylaws, and I want to ensure that if we're going to pass this motion that we would have a very legally defensible position. So I'm looking for a legal opinion in respect to whether this motion really stands the test of scrutiny and what we could be expecting to see when you use the word consideration for allowing.
Mr. Mayor, legal staff have looked at this. It is legal staff's considered view that the proposed distinction is legally defensible. Could it be challenged? Of course, it's always open to people to challenge the decisions of the city and city council, but that the distinction that's drawn in the motion is a legally defensible one.
Perfect. Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor Dudas. Councillor Menard, please.
Thanks, Mayor. And I have a question about the El Chanteri de Ruse motion. But then I was going to wrap up. So did you want me to just do that all at once later, or?
Yeah, you can do that now.
Okay, so I'll do that at the end. And the question is to staff around the El Chanteri de Ruse motion and whether they support it or not, or their opinion on it. But I'll come back.
So you come back to wrap up? Okay. Councillor de Ruse, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and I just want to, of course, thank our colleagues and the people that have been working on the report. I know Mr. DeMonte's team, Valerie, and the chair of CPS, and many other departments that working with us. I just want to take a moment to identify and talk a little bit about Councillor Chantiri and I's motion. We really in support of the report. We really want to make sure to see that these rules and policies are implemented, but sometimes while we're doing some policy, sometimes we try to fix something, we break something else. And in rural area right now, we do not have the issues of parking. We do not have what's going on in other areas in the city. And I always be careful and cautious when I talk about the city. But as we all know that we have three different communities. We have suburbia, we have urban, then we have rural. But for us, we have lots of farm homes, that we have lots of features in our rural area. People in Netherlands, people in Sweden, in Europe, and everywhere across the country, they like to come to rural Ottawa to check our dairy farm, our crop operation. And in rural farm, always our farmhouse build in the feature that you'll always have two separate entrances. And sometimes we have coach house features, and we have a little barn. So we want to make sure we really don't impact the whole city with this motion. And that's why we carefully tread around it, and we work very closely with our legal department, with our bylaw, with our CPS chair, Jenna. I want to thank her very much for putting all the effort, and Mr. DeMonte. So we're not asking much, but it's really the consideration, and the amount is very minimum. It's not going to impact anybody. But also, we need to be careful when we implement policy. You don't want to actually one size doesn't fit all, and we also don't want to create an issue where there is no issue. So I encourage you to help us and to help and support this motion, because really we are in support of the report, and we really want to make sure that the Airbnb has been really policed properly, and we have good rules to be able to implement those in suburbia and urban. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Councillor Englai, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I want to thank staff. This is something that I've been watching very carefully and working with staff on. There's been a number of issues around short-term rentals in my ward, and staff has been very sensitive to those issues, I think, in their recommendations, and has really listened to the public. So I want to thank them for that. I also want to thank my colleague, Jenna Suds, who chaired a long and at times intense meeting in terms of people's experiences with this kind of approach in their neighborhood. So I want to thank her for that as well. And I also want to thank Councillors El Chantiri and de Ruse. I was a little nervous when I first saw their motion, the earlier draft, in terms of there wasn't a lot of definition around what rural meant, and I did not want to see this motion act as a gateway to opening the door for other types of duplexes, triplexes. We had that discussion fully at committee, and it was something that people hold very strong opinions over, and rightfully so, I think, in terms of the use of residential properties in suburban areas and urban areas. And so I'm glad to see the current wording, which makes it very clear what is meant by the term rural, and that this motion does not allow that creep, if you will, into suburban areas and more urban areas, because that's something, while it might fit in the rurals, doesn't fit, from what we're hearing from our residents, doesn't fit in the urban and suburban environment. So I thank my colleagues for listening to that and making those amendments to their earlier draft. I appreciate that. It recognizes that not necessarily one size fits all in this city, but is, again, as with the staff recommendations, I think sensitive to the concerns of urban and suburban councillors on the issue of expanding short-term rentals. So thank you for that, and I will be supporting the report, and I'll be supporting it as amended by the motion of my colleagues. So thank you.
Right, thank you, Councillor Engelai. Councillor McKenney, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and I also want to echo Councillor Engelai in thanking the Chair, Suds, for chairing a very long and difficult meeting into a Friday night, nonetheless. So thank you for that. I'm not going to speak long. I said lots at that 10.5-hour meeting, as you can well imagine, had all my questions answered. But just on Councillor El-Shantiri's motion, which I support in principle, but we know that, and great news since we passed this at committee, that the LPAT appeal in Toronto has been resolved, and it does, indicate that the direction that we are headed it's the right time. It's the right time to do it. It was upheld by the LPAT. So, but I just on Councillor El-Shantiri's motion to legal, do you? What is your advice whether this might open up an appeal, potential for an appeal?
I'm going to invite Mr. Mark, as our resident expert in these areas, to provide us with an answer on that.
Yes, thank you.
Madam Chair, as Mr. Mayor, as the city solicitor said earlier, there's always the potential for an appeal. The same provisions under the Planning Act apply to temporary use zoning bylaws as apply to permanent zoning bylaws. However, again, as the city solicitor indicated, in my opinion, there is a meaningful distinction recognized in our official plan between the rural area and the urban area, and I think it is defensible to permit them in secondary dwelling units and coach houses in the rural area while not permitting them in the urban area.
It is. Okay. Thank you for that clarification. I appreciate that. I will be supporting the motion.
Councillor Menard, to wrap up.
Thanks very much. And just on the question, the motion as it reads is that staff would consider allowing secondary dwelling units and coach houses in the rural areas to be used for short-term rentals regardless of occupancy. So you're going to consider this and come back with the associated bylaw. Is that what this motion is directing you to do? And do you support that line of direction?
That is correct, Mr. Mayor, and we have worked, as we've worked with your motion, with both councillors, and we do support it.
Okay, I'll be supporting that then as well. Just on wrap-up, Mayor, on the landlord registration, I want to be clear. The motion is not saying to start a pilot. That's not what we're saying. We're saying to come back with an option, the feasibility around a program, what it would look like. And there's been a lot of work put into this by McLaren Municipal Consulting and others that we shouldn't just lose. We should make sure we're taking that information and looking at what a pilot project would actually look like, and at that time make a decision. We haven't done that work yet, so I want to be really clear what this is. I also checked with staff about the bylaw work plan. This piece of work doesn't affect it. If we made a decision then to go forward, that's when we would have the discussion around the timing and effect there. They've also confirmed they would like us to come back in Q3 of 2020, and the motion accommodates the timing for them to come back in Q3 of 2020. So we've accommodated that. I want to put this in perspective too. What this would do is put us on the path of switching from a reactive model of bylaw enforcement to a proactive model of enforcement, and it matters. Tenants are currently unaware of their rights as tenants, many of them are. Also unaware of the provisions of Ottawa's bylaws in some cases, and it shouldn't be up to them to enforce those rights and provisions. But even for those that are aware, it often doesn't make sense for them to report those provisions because of the negative consequences. So the landlord-tenant relationship is an asymmetrical one. It leads to tenants not bothering to report problems on the bylaw because it's a risk for them to do so in many cases. And it's why I think we should be taking more responsibility for our own regulatory enforcement. I want to speak to the cost to tenants. We've heard that raised in the cost to tenants. I think there's problems with that argument. We have an $11 a year registration per unit, which is highly reasonable. It's also within the currently allowable rent control increases in Ontario for the vast majority of units in Ottawa. Even if there is a small cost increase to tenants, even if we take that argument through and say, okay, we'll agree there is some small cost to tenants, the quality of rentals and landlords will improve. And so some good landlords are saying, yeah, I'm advocating for this. I want to see this happen. And when tenants are wrongfully pushed out of their homes, we actually see rent increasing more than it would otherwise. So the effect of not doing this is that there are effects for tenants all across the city in increases in rent when they're not, when they're wrongfully evicted. I think there's more important context as well. So there's much more trivial matters that require registration or licensing. So going fishing, you have to register to go fishing. You have to have a license. You have to have a license for your dogs and cat or register them with the city. We require it for taxis and PTC drivers. We're soon going to require it for Airbnb hosts. And so there's a bunch of professions that we do this for as well, around engineers and nurses. So some registration for those who house others is likely reasonable, given that we do this for things like fishing and dogs and cats. The other possible benefits too, the landlord registrations would also give the city a huge opportunity to ensure that its building code and zoning bylaws are being enforced, which currently many of them are not. The city's relevant enforcement officers often lack the ability to enter units to do a proper investigation. So this would give the city an opportunity to ensure that our standards are being complied with and ensure the safety and well-being of our city's renters. It doesn't mean that everything's going to be inspected. We can do what staff are saying to look at individual problem properties. That's what this would help with. And so we've seen some successes on this program in Toronto through RentSafe. Yes, in high-rises. We have high-rises here as well. Not as many, but we have them. And let's not forget that our consultant who we hired to do this work has said, put this in place. We're not even saying that. We're just saying look at the option of putting it in place, which staff have said they can accommodate within existing budgets. So I urge you to vote in favor of this motion. Let's not let this go by the wayside. There's a lot of good work that's been put into this. Let's make sure we fully examine this before not seeing it again for several years. Thanks. And I'll call yeas and nays on that, Mayor, the motion.
Yeah, we're not there yet, though. Yeah. Councillor El Shantiri to wrap up.
Well, I'll make it short and sweet, Mr. Mayor. I just want to take this opportunity to thank our staff for helping out drafting this motion. I want to really sincere thank you to the General Manager of Planning, Infrastructure, Economic Development, to temporary use the bylaw for the short-term rental use in a residential area. So also be able to define the rural to satisfy my colleague Eglai, who had concern about this earlier. So I'm grateful for all the support of all of you, and especially my colleague George Darousse seconding this motion. So obviously we'll be asking for the ayes and nays on this motion.
Thank you. Okay, I have a couple of comments. First of all, I echo my colleagues' sentiments to thank very much Councillor Sudds and members of CPS. That was a long day indeed. When people buy a home in a residential neighborhood, they expect fellow residential dwellers, not a ghost hotel, not a party place. They don't expect to see a constant turnover of people coming in and out of the house all days of the evening. I think when Airbnb first started, the premise was pretty clear. If you're away for a couple weekends a year, you rent out your place. And you, in essence, have some skin in the game because you don't want your home wrecked by people who've come from another city or another part of the world. And obviously, what's evolved is that this has become a big moneymaker for a lot of people. They buy units, often condominiums, townhouses, don't even live in the city in many instances, and then end up having a tenant that's a bad tenant and disrupting the well-being and the calmness of living in a residential neighborhood. So I support the report. I thank Councillors El-Shantiri and Darousse for their amendment because once again it shows that our council understands. We have a large piece of geography, and in the rural areas, for instance, there are no hotels. So when there was flooding issues, people opened up their homes, and some voluntarily, others to recoup some costs, and I think that's a good, sensible motion. On the Councillor Menard King motion, as well as item 5 in the report, which is asking me to write to impose a system of licenses, I'll speak to both the registration and the license system. I do not support this, and I strongly urge you not to go down the path. We have a situation where we're asking staff to work on a new program without any clear direction from council, and to do so is putting the cart before the horse. So here's the problem with it. In the staff report, pages 35 to 37, it was very clear that to go about having a registration and or a licensing system is expensive to the city, but most importantly to the tenants. So scenario A, universal licensing and inspection, inspecting more than 133,000 units, which is what we have in Ottawa, would on an annual basis require 182 full-time equivalent positions and resulting in expected monthly rent increases of $25 a month. I don't think many people were told that. And then in the same report, it goes on to say that the additional cost for residents is of concern to staff. Based on the 30% cost-to-income ratio for housing affordability, staff calculate that licensing fees within the above ranges used by other jurisdictions would increase affordability threshold for each unit by $720 to $1,150, meaning that without a corresponding rise in household income, this would result in a greater proportion of residents living in unaffordable conditions. So there's a cost to this, a cost to register, a cost to license, and that cost would be borne by the tenants. And some of the people who are least likely to have an extra $720 to $1,150 are not going to be impressed with us going down the path of creating another bureaucracy with hundreds of people inspecting and licensing. We have provisions. They're not perfect, but I can tell you as a former Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing, our laws, both municipally and provincially, are some of the best in the country, including our property standards bylaw, fire inspections, LTB, and the like. So on the Menard King motion, if you are interested in creating more bureaucracy and putting our staff in a position to come back and tell us this is exactly what's already in the report, or of increasing rents to people in the lowest income, I suggest you vote for that. If not, please say no to this motion to create another level of bureaucracy with more registration. And on the licensing aspect, please vote against item number 5, which I'll call for yeas and nays. The final thing is on Councillor Meehan's motion. Just a clarification, Councillor, I'm not sure the wording. It says the impact on the community of large group. What is the definition of a large group? Is it a large group of people living in the place?
A large group of people who rent. Sometimes in some homes, you can have upwards of 15 people if they turn it into a party location. So we're looking at a large group. Yeah, large group of people.
Thank you. So I'm not finished yet. So the reality is that there is a cost to implementing a new licensing regime or a registration regime. And I would encourage you, please do not burden those men and women who are working hard to pay their rent by bringing forward a new bureaucracy that will cost them hundreds of dollars a year. I don't think that's fair to the lowest income residents in our community. On a point of order, Councillor Fleury.
You raised the issue following committee. We were asking, pending this report approval, that you write to the Ministry of Municipal Affairs on the authority of business licensing, and I don't know if you commented specifically.
Yeah, well, the reality is, you know, if you ask for something, it's generally because you want the power. I don't want us to get into a system of imposing licenses that is going to drive up the price for tenants. So,
just to be clear, it's on short-term rental.
Yeah, no, I recognize that. Thank you. It's not a point of order. So we have asked for a number of items to be split, so we'll go page by page. Item 1, carried. Item 2, carried. Item 3, dissent by Councillor Blais. Yeah, okay. Item 4, carried. Item 5, I'm going to ask for yeas and nays. And then we'll do the amendments. This is asking me to write to the minister to create a licensing system, the ability to create a licensing system. I'd encourage you to vote no on this.
Well, can we have it on the screen? That's not what it says.
Yeah.
It's not what it says.
It says, request the mayor ask the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing to make changes to Ontario regulation to clarify the city has the authority to implement a business licensing bylaw imposing a system of licenses for rentals.
That's not the accurate section, Mr. Mayor. It's been amended from the committee.
Madam Deputy Clerk, what's changed?
Mr. Mayor, recommendation 5 is the wording that was approved at committee. We have received no further motions to amend that wording.
We amended it with the help of the clerk as it relates to short-term rental. This section was not specific to short-term rental, and that's what we amended at committee.
Well, the Deputy Clerk has said there's been no amendment brought forward, so this is what's before us. So yeas and nays?
Councillor Leeper.
Yes.
Councillor Gower.
No.
Councillor Deans. Councillor Harder. No. Councillor Eglai.
No.
Councillor Hubley.
No.
Councillor Sudds.
No.
Councillor El Shantiri.
No.
Councillor Dudas.
No.
Councillor Menard.
Yes.
Councillor Shirelli. Councillor Cloutier.
No.
Councillor Tierney.
No.
Councillor Brockington.
No.
Councillor Meehan.
No.
Councillor Derouz.
No.
Conseil Fleury.
Oui.
Conseil Blais.
No.
Councillor McKinney.
Yes.
Councillor King.
Yes.
Councillor Moffat.
No.
Councillor Kavanaugh.
Yes.
Councillor Luloff. Mayor Watson.
No.
6 yeas, 15 nays.
Okay, so the amendments as it received them in order. Councillor El Shantiri, seconded by Councillor Derouz, with respect to rural parts of the city. Carried. On the Menard King, I'll ask for yeas and nays on the startup of a registration system. And we'll get it on the board. There it is. Yeas and nays, please.
Councillor Leeper.
Yes.
Councillor Gower.
No.
Councillor Deans. Councillor Harder.
No.
Councillor Eglai. Councillor Hubley.
No.
Councillor Sudds.
No.
Councillor El Shantiri.
No.
Councillor Dudas.
No.
Councillor Menard.
Yes.
Councillor Shirelli. Conseil Cloutier.
No.
Councillor Tierney.
No.
Councillor Brockington.
Yes.
Councillor Meehan.
No.
Councillor Derouz.
No.
Conseil Fleury.
Oui.
Conseil Blais.
No.
Yes.
Councillor McKinney.
Yes.
Councillor King.
Yes.
Councillor Moffat.
No.
Councillor Kavanagh.
Yes.
Councillor Luloff. Mayor Watson.
No.
8 yeas, 13 nays.
And on the direction to
Mayor,
staff
Mr.
by
Mayor,
Karen-
just
no.
to clarify, mine was a no, and there was a yes right after. I want to make sure it was recorded properly.
Yours was no on this one?
Yes, yeah, yeah.
Mr.
absolutely.
That would change the balance by
Yeah.
one. It is.
Someone said yes right into the
7.
microphone right after I said no.
Thank you for
Yeah.
the clarification.
Thank you for clarification. So Councillor Meehan's direction to staff? Carried. Okay, on the report as amended? Carried. Okay. Our next item is item 10, Lansdowne Partnership Plan Annual Report. There's a motion by Councillor Menard, I believe, and Brockington.
Thanks, Mayor. I'm actually just going to comment on this and speak to the concern I had. So I'm in favor of the Luloff motion on this, and I'm going to be voting for that today. And I'd urge all my colleagues to do the same. Let me just explain what I'm trying to ensure, and I've had good conversations with the colleagues around the table, but I want us to be aware that there's 2 audits directly related to our decision on the operations of Lansdowne Park. One is a follow-up on the management and oversight of the park, and the other is on the waterfall. The Auditor General is undertaking both of these audits at the same time, and they're underway right now. The motion I was proposing would have allowed Mr. Chenier and the city to move forward with consultations immediately and discussions with OSEG. It would not have delayed their work. In other words, it was perfectly in line with the Luloff motion. The Auditor General confirmed yesterday that it makes sense to have this information in front of council before we make any decisions on a change to the operations of the park. And it's his intent to bring this forward before our decision by the end of Q2 2020, but the audits obviously take their own life when they're occurring. So I've spoken with colleagues around the table and members of the audit committee about this item. It seems we have consensus that if we hit May or June and we still don't have that information from the AG, that we'd ask them how many weeks would be required and ensure that this important information comes to us before a final decision. So with that assurance, I feel comfortable pulling the draft motion I had prepared for today, and we'll be voting in favor of the Luloff motion.
Good move, thank you. Okay, on the report, carried. Thank you very much. No, motion to adopt reports. Motion portant adoption de rapport, excusez-moi. Councillor Gower, please.
That the deferred report from Community and Protective Services Committee entitled Motion Rat Complaints Inquiry, the report from the Integrity Commissioner entitled Integrity Commissioner 2019 Annual Report, Agricultural and Rural Affairs Committee Report 8, Built Heritage Subcommittee Report 7, Community and Protective Services Committee Reports 8 and 9, Standing Committee on Environmental Protection, Water and Waste Management Report 7, Finance and Economic Development Committee Report 9, Planning Committee Report 16, Transit Commission Report 3, Transportation Committee Report 6, and the reports from the City Clerk entitled Status Update, Council Inquiries and Motions for the period ending November 22nd, 2019, and Summary of Oral and Written Public Submissions for items subject to the Planning Act explanation requirements at the City Council meeting of November 6, 2019, be received and adopted as amended.
So if we hold off on that because I neglected to come back to item 17, and Councillor Tierney and I have a motion. He, as you know, is our representative of the FCM, and they have a meeting with the leader of the NDP in 10 minutes. So I was wondering, with concurrence of council, we could deal with Councillor Tierney's motion with respect to us bidding on the FCM bid. Agreed? Suspension of the rules on the Tierney-Watson motion re-FCM bid on suspension. Agreed. Councillor Tierney.
Great. Thank you, colleagues. As you know, a couple of years ago, we had the FCM AGM held here in Ottawa with great success. It brought much tourism, many people to our community, and I'll dispense with reading the very long, written up, well-written motion, and just we're going to make we want to bid for the 2023-2024 FCM AGM here again in Ottawa. And just of note, the actual board members are meeting in the city right now, and as the mayor has mentioned, I'll be meeting with all the leaders of the parties over the next 2 days. This is great for us as a city because it gives us the opportunity to really explain municipal issues to our leaders. So therefore, be resolved that Council approve the motion as a measure of the city's support in being the host city for either the 2023 or 2024 FCM Annual Conference and Trade Show, and be it further resolved that the city grants authority to Ottawa Tourism to bid on the city's behalf for the 2023-2024 FCM Annual Conference and Trade Show in consultation with the city's Economic and Development Services.
Great. On the motion? Carried. Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Tierney. Councillor Meehan, item 17, housing mix in new residential communities. You had a question?
I do, Mr. Mayor. Thank you. It has to do with this recommendation from staff is meant to decrease the proportion of single-family dwellings in new residential neighborhoods, which would mean that we would increase the multi-unit units that are going to be built. And on the face of it, I understand why we are doing this. Intensification is required in outlying areas of the city. But my question has to do with the problems that arise with this. Anybody who visits a new suburban area will recognize that we have a serious parking issue in suburban areas in residential neighborhoods. Builders are not making driveways that can accommodate barely one car, let alone two. And what happens is that we end up with people parking on the street. And while I know that we're supposed to be encouraging people, or we want more and more people to be on transit in the city and to leave their cars at home, Ottawa is a vast city, and our busing cannot accommodate everyone to get exactly where they want to go. So people are buying these residential units, and they have 1, 2 cars, sometimes 3 cars. So the question I want to say is, do we have a plan to recognize what we are doing in the outlying areas of the city? And I ask this because when we don't accommodate vehicles, and we're never going to eliminate them in the outlying areas, specifically because of the reasons I'm talking about. We incur costs, continual costs to the city, with bylaw going out to address complaints, parking, going out and ticketing vehicles. Emergency vehicles often can't get through streets where they're parking on both sides of the street. We know that snow plows have to go back continually. There is a constant and evolving cost to the city all the time because of what we're allowing. So, not to mention the environment that's being created, which it's not pleasant to drive down these new residential neighborhoods. So, Mr. Willis, I'm asking, is there any recognition of what we're allowing to happen in the residential neighborhoods? And is there a solution to what I see is the reality of allowing people to, to build smaller driveways and not have parking pads in these multi-unit dwellings so that we can accommodate snowplows and make the living environment a little bit nicer?
So, Mr. Mayor, we certainly, as we get more intensive neighborhoods built in suburban outlying areas, we are seeing these problems. And we've actually, in the process of releasing it has actually already been released, a discussion paper has been released to the industry on a parking evaluation tool under our Building Better and Smarter Suburbs project. What that does is, what we've observed when we looked at these issues is when you get too much of a clustering of the same unit type on the same street, this is where the problems get. But if there was a better mix of walk-ups and singles in the area, and they were actually deployed a little bit differently, we don't see the same on-street parking problems. So what we're trying to do in new developments is try to avoid a heavy clustering of all the same unit types in the same area on the same street to do that. And so that's what the new tool is meant to address. We are consulting with the industry on that right now and intend to start applying it on all new plans of subdivision, and we're actually piloting it on a few right now.
Would that include even single-family dwellings? Because what we're seeing now is people paving over their lawns in order to accommodate 2 vehicles, and that's unsightly and really drives neighbors crazy.
Mr. Mayor, in some instances when they're doing that, they're not actually in conformity with city zoning bylaws, and we do deal with this through enforcement. We do understand in areas that don't yet have the higher order transit, this is a risk, but we also run the opposite risk that if we encourage very, very large parking deployment in these areas that create a lot of hard surfaces in areas we intend to provide higher order transit to, we're kind of defeating ourselves and supporting our transit-oriented development approach.
I totally understand why we are supporting transit-oriented development, but the reality is, talking to people, they need their vehicles just to get around this city because the buses can't take them everywhere they want to go. So, I mean, I think we have to start seriously addressing this issue. Parking is going to be an ongoing problem, and I would like to see us as a city address it seriously. With the developers. The way that we develop is causing all kinds of social issues and operational issues.
So, Mr. Mayor, as I indicated, we have this brand new tool. This new tool is really meant to address it based on the observed patterns. We did a fair bit of work to understand which streets we were seeing these problems on, and we will be applying it in new plans of subdivision. We're piloting it. We will continue to review it. We will continue to report to Planning Committee on our success on addressing the issue, but it is a fine balance. You know, we do need to get the higher densities to meet our broader land consumption goals, and again, we are trying to not undermine our own efforts to encourage people to take transit.
I thank you for that, Mr. Willis. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Hubley, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just want to clarify a couple of things that my colleague just said that I don't think is factual. We are not approving houses with barely room for 1 car. The standard is there's, in most suburban houses, there's a garage and at least parking for 1 car, often more than that. The issue that she raises does exist. We don't need to exaggerate it with extra claims like that we're doing something we shouldn't have done. Last term of council, we set in specific rules on how, especially in suburban areas, they could expand their driveway. There still has to be 50% green space. So as Mr. Willis correctly pointed out, if you see someone paving over their front yard, which does happen, it's illegal. You can call bylaw. I've lived this in my own area. Bylaw will come in and have them dig it up. So there is already a solution on the books for this. It just involves monitoring and educating people on what they can do and can't do. Under Building Better Suburbs, there was a lot of work done on parking in the suburbs. As Mr. Willis said, the mix of houses. There's also, without getting into too much detail, I encourage the new members of council to read that report because it represents about 2 years worth of work that Councillor Harder and I did with a lot of stakeholders involved to actually come out with how we can address these issues. So the new developments will be built under those guidelines. And one last point, Mr. Mayor, is under our traffic calming programs and working in conjunction with Kevin Wiley's folks, you can designate no parking on suburban streets in certain areas. Sometimes it's just the turns that are on the street, but they're very good at telling us where their plows and emergency vehicles can't get by if there's cars. I know I've done it. I think every other suburban councillor, with the exception of my colleague, I guess, has done that, where we've gone out and worked with our community associations and residents to actually sign the streets to avoid those problems, because the last thing we want is on any street in our city, whether it be suburban, rural, or urban, that a fire truck can't get there or an ambulance if it's needed. So I don't think we need to exaggerate the problem. There is a problem. We have tools in place to fix it. It's just a matter of working with staff, and you can address whatever street in your community you're having issues with. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and I want to thank Mr. Willis and Mr. Wiley for their work on this with us.
Thank you. Councillor Blais.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I agree with Councillor Hubley that we should work on a case-by-case basis, which is why I'm going to be voting against this. This takes all of our leverage away from the builders. They often apply right now for this density, and it's often approved, and it's approved through negotiation. It's approved through additional community benefit. It's getting the park faster. It's getting a bigger park with more money put into it. It's getting intersection modifications or speed reduction, whatever it is that you're asking for as part of that process, you're getting in exchange for the higher densities. I would urge everyone to consider that. In the suburbs, do you want the kind of fights to get the things out of the builders that we see our urban colleagues go through in exchange for height? Or do you want to not be able to have that conversation with your builder? Or do you want to maintain the leverage over them to get those community benefits out of them in exchange for the higher densities? So let's not give them this density by default. Let's negotiate it for the benefit of the community on a case-by-case basis. Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Gower.
I think my colleagues are making mountains out of molehills in terms of this report. The place to have the discussion about minimum densities in the mix of housing is through the upcoming official plan process, which I know the planning department is working on. This is a report that formalizes a number of OPA agreements and subdivision agreements that have already occurred, and it just formalizes it to give consistency to the policies and to the zoning bylaws and everything that we have in place. So I'll be supporting this, and I think we spent too much time on it today.
Okay, anyone else? On the report, carried. The clerk's, Councillor Meehan is dissenting and Councillor Blais. The clerk's office indicated they're going to look at recommendation 5 with respect to asking me to write to the minister to see if there is a discrepancy between what was approved at council or committee and what was brought forward at council, and they'll get back to us. Is that correct? Okay. So we already had Councillor Gower move his motion on motion to adopt reports. Carried. Motions of which notice have been given previously. Conseiller Brockington, appuyé par Conseiller Blais. Councillor Brockington, please.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just a motion that we've dealt with in the past in some communities that are about to undergo infrastructure renewal. This is actually one of the 2 communities I referenced earlier today with respect to RATs. This just ensures that driveway widths are returned back to the original state once this work is done. Again, there's precedence that we've done this in the past. There have been no complaints issued or called in thus far, and I'm asking for council support today.
Okay, anyone else on this item? On the motion, carried, adopté. Motions requiring suspension of the rules of procedure. Councillor McKenney, please. On suspension, carried. On the motion?
Carried.
You want to explain, as the public, one of the things I often hear from the public is they don't always know what's being carried, so you can just introduce the motion.
I will. It's whereas the building on the parcel of land known as 486, 488, 490, 500 Preston Street is considered to be in a state of disrepair, and whereas there is contamination on the site, and whereas given the dilapidated condition of the building and the desire of the property owner to remediate the site prior to future redevelopment, and whereas there is currently no building permit application for a replacement building, therefore be it resolved that council approve demolition control for the existing building on the property subject to the following conditions. The registered owner shall obtain a building permit for a replacement building by June 30th, 2020. If a building permit is not issued by said date, the registered owner shall within 1 month landscape the property to the satisfaction of the general manager of planning, infrastructure, and economic development. The registered owner shall prohibit the use of the property for other interim uses and maintain the property in accordance with the property standards bylaw. 2, the landscaping of the property shall include benches, sod, and garden boxes and be finalized in accordance with conditions established by the general manager of PIED. You're okay if I call you that? The registered owner agrees that, subject to the discretion of the general manager, planning, infrastructure, and economic development department, a replacement building must be substantially completed within 2 years from the date of this approval, and in default thereof, the city clerk shall enter on the collector's roll the sum of $5,000 for the residential dwelling to be demolished. that general manager, PIED department may impose such other conditions as he deems appropriate. The register owner shall enter into an agreement with the City of Ottawa to include the foregoing conditions, pay all costs associated with the registration of said agreement at such time as a building permit is issued to redevelop the site and the replacement building is in place. The agreement will become null and void and will be released. Upon request of the owner shall pay all costs associated with the release of the agreement. The register owner agrees that a demolition permit will not be issued and the building cannot be demolished until such time that the agreement referenced herein has been executed and registered on title. Lastly, this approval is considered null and void if the agreement is not executed within 1 month of council's approval or if the building is not demolished prior to January 31st, 2020.
An excellent summary, Council.
Thank you. En français, I agree with it. It's just important to know that I agree with it. So, yeah, it's
So
all
on the
good.
motion, carried, adopté. Are there any other notices of, other motions requiring suspension of the rules of procedure? Notices of motion. Motion to introduce bylaws. Motion portant présentation de règlement. Councillor Gower, second by Councillor Moffat, please.
Que les règlements énumérés à l'ordre du jour
That the bylaws listed on the agenda under motion to introduce bylaws 3 readings be read and passed.
Law, Councillor Gower, please.
que le règlement suivant soit lu et
That the following bylaw be read and passed to confirm the proceedings of council meeting of November 27, 2019. Carried.
Madam Deputy Clerk. Adjournment, Councillor Gower.
the proceedings of the City Council meeting of November 27, 2019 be adjourned.
Carried. Thank you. Merci. Meeting adjourned.